Publisher's Preface. Making the works of William Shakespeare generally available to his myriad readers has a long history. Although even the most loyal and enthusiastic of his contemporaries may not, perhaps, have allowed his writings the kind of universal esteem in which the world, and not just the English-speaking world, now holds them, they nonetheless witnessed in 1623, only 7 years after his death, the publication of what is usually called the First Folio, a collection of 36 plays that has furnished the basis of what we now call the Shakespeare canon. The editorial tradition initiated by the First Folio, itself based on a variety of different sources, authorial or scribal drafts, earlier published quarto editions of individual plays, and prompt books or other theatrically associated manuscripts, has grown mightily and become increasingly refined and more solidly focused over the many years since Nicholas Rowe's first edited edition appeared in 1709. The Riverside Shakespeare, then, is only one of the latest links in a long and honorable chain of editorial and critical labors, even though it has, happily, become for most the standard one-volume Shakespeare for critical reference and for teaching. It is the cornerstone of Houghton Mifflin's college publishing program, and the touchstone of quality for all the company's efforts. This second edition of the Riverside Shakespeare owes its existence to the hands and minds of many. It is their cooperative work that has produced the pages that follow. It is my privilege to represent all of them in introducing this new edition to many readers who will be informed, educated, and delighted by what it contains. Nader F. Dare Shori, Chairman, Houghton Mifflin Company. Acknowledgements for the second edition. The Riverside Shakespeare was first published 23 years ago. Since then, of course, students of Shakespeare have been very busy, both critically and textually, and a great deal of scholarly work has consequently been published. Something like a sea change has taken place in critical approaches, many of them relatively new approaches, which see the plays and poems through eyes that focus primarily on sociological, political, new historicist, and gender-oriented values. Varieties of criticism that are also often reflected in new theatrical productions. To meet such very real challenges, we have added an interpretive essay by Heather Dubrow entitled 20th Century Shakespeare Criticism, and a continuation of Charles H. Shattuck's Shakespeare's Plays in Performance from 1660 to 1971. William T. Liston's Shakespeare's Plays in Performance from 1970. Other major editions include The Reign of King Edward III, a history play now generally accepted as, at least in part, by Shakespeare, published here for the first time in a one-volume works since the 1870s, and A Funeral Elegy by W.S., 1612, a poem recently claimed for Shakespeare by Donald W. Foster. The essay Shakespeare's Text and the note on the text that is appended to each of the plays and poems have been thoroughly revised in the light of the many textual studies that have appeared since 1974. Also revised, updated, and enlarged are the chronology and sources, records, documents, and allusions, and the selected bibliography. We have gone heavily into debt to a small army of generous helpers who have made this second edition possible. Our good friends, William Bond, Philip Finkelpearl, Jonathan Hart, John Klaus, and Vincent Petronella have come to our rescue when critical help was most urgently needed, and we are very grateful for their support. And to those who served as our computer amanuenses, our deepest thanks are also due. Scott Gordon, Carla Mazio, Eric Wilson, Marie Henson, Doug Trevor, and Susanna Tobin, who, at a moment of crisis, single-handedly took over. As always in the past, the staffs of the Widner and Houghton libraries have been continually helpful, with special thanks due to Carolyn Fawcett, Frederick W. Wilson, and Annette Fern, the curator and research and reference librarian of the Harvard Theater Collection, were more than generous with both time and materials, placing the extraordinary richness of the collection entirely at our disposal. We are, of course, deeply indebted to Houghton Mifflin, particularly to Dean Johnson and Janet Young, both of whom have provided unstinting support coupled with great patience. Sarah Ambrose also provided technical assistance in the book's production. We would also like to thank Susan Boulanger, who copy edited our typescripts, Rebecca Cottenham, who proofread new material, and Rose Corbett Gordon, who helped to assemble many of the new illustrations. Finally, to our wives, Betty and Rosemary, who together with us suffered all of the many second edition birth pangs, we offer loving salutations. Laudate Uxoris, G. Blakemore Evans, J. M. Tobin. Acknowledgements for the first edition. The textual editor has received, over the years, much special help and advice from friends and colleagues, which it is now his happy privilege to acknowledge. Dr. Marie Edel, apart from her own share in this edition, has served throughout as an unofficial general editor, and her learning, critical insight, and infallible eye for detail have placed me, sine spe, profoundly in her debt. Our long association has been a continuing source of pleasure to me. Professor Marvin Spivak, who used the present text as the basis for his complete and systematic concordance to the works of Shakespeare, has been more than helpful in a variety of ways, particularly in rechecking the accuracy of the text and textual notes. To both these friends, my gratitude goes far beyond anything I can possibly express. I am further greatly indebted to the unfailing kindness and patience of the staffs of the Houghton Library and the Harvard Theater Collection, especially to my old friend, Dr. William Bond, director of the Houghton Library, Miss Carolyn Jakeman, Miss Catherine Pantzer, Miss Mart Shaw, and Dr. Jean Newlett. Miss Eva Faye Benton, English librarian at the University of Illinois, also has my special thanks, as do Professors Michael T. Kiernan, Frederick Kiefer, and David George, each of whom in different ways assisted me at need. Finally, to my wife, who with truly Spartan endurance read aloud to me the complete text, including all the punctuation marks, I offer once again my wondering and loving thanks for her continual support in this and all other things. G. Blakemore Evans. The Riverside Shakespeare General Introduction, Harry Levin, The Shakespearean Heritage. Now and again, the observation is offered about a great writer, that he has created a world of his own. Such artificial worlds are necessarily smaller than the one we live in, otherwise they would not help us much to understand it. Like a map, they locate situations by reducing them to a comprehensible scale. Lifelike and large as these representations of truth may seem to us, they are limited nonetheless by the means and motives of their creation. Yet the writers whom we regard as the very greatest have a way of surpassing limitations by convincing us that their range of perception is just as wide, and their sense of reality just as authentic as anything that we are ever likely to encounter during the course of our own experience. So the ancients placed Homer in a unique position, because his epic outlook seemed to be coextensive with the breadth and depth of the world they knew. Similarly, for the Middle Ages, all the circumstances of human existence were summed up in the luminous vision of Dante. Since then, man's horizons have so enlarged, and his problems have so complicated themselves, that although he still can find much beauty and significance in the poetry of Homer and Dante, they have long since ceased to serve as active guides. Indeed, if it were not for Shakespeare, we might well doubt whether any single creative genius could have encompassed so much of the variety, the profundity, and the abundance of life as it has been lived in the modern era of civilization. Shakespeare's works have therefore been accorded a place in our culture above and beyond their topmost place in our literature. They have been virtually canonized as humanistic scriptures, the tested residue of pragmatic wisdom, a general collection of quotable texts and usable examples. Reprinted, re-edited, commented upon, and translated into most languages, they have preempted more space on the library shelves than the books of or about any other author. Meanwhile, they have become a staple of the school and college curricula, as well as the happiest of hunting grounds for scholars and critics. As plays, they continue to meet the one decisive criterion by maintaining their importance in the dramatic repertory, all the way from Harlem to Uzbekistan, and to provide the roles that leading actors compete in when they seek to demonstrate their talents. Ever since David Garrick staged his Stratford Jubilee of 1769, Shakespeare's native town has been a shrine for literary pilgrims. More recently, its festival has come to set a standard for Shakespearean productions, and now the cult has spread to transatlantic Stratfords in Ontario and Connecticut, not to mention regular performance at innumerable theaters elsewhere. If all this seems to smack too uncritically of ritual observance and traditional piety, we should be reminded that Shakespearean drama has continually renewed itself through adaptation to changing times. It has adapted not only to contemporary dress, but to contemporary issues, current issues. Thus, the conflicts of the Roman plays have been sharpened by the political pressures of the 20th century. Shakespeare showed prophetic insight into our own future when, looking back to Rome and Julius Caesar, he allowed his Cassius to look ahead down the centuries to come. How many ages hence shall this our lofty scene be acted o'er, in states unborn and accents yet unknown? The leading spirit among his fellow dramatists, Ben Jonson, also foresaw that triumphant survival when he prefaced Shakespeare's first folio with the poetic tribute, "He was not of an age, but for all time." But Jonson, who was well aware that such universality must have its basis in a firm grasp of immediacy, had begun his poem by hailing Shakespeare as the major voice of his time, soul of the age. Few of his contemporaries had been quite so magnanimous or far-seeing. The earliest critical recognition of his career had been a truculent outburst from a Robert Greene, hack writing upon his very deathbed in 1592, and denouncing Shakespeare as a young upstart for his presumption in vying with those already established playwrights whom we call the university wits. That outburst was countered soon enough by a handsome retraction from Greene's editor, Henry Chettle, and the subsequent testimonials from Shakespeare's colleagues suggest their personal affection and professional esteem. In those days, however, merely to be recognized as a playwright was to be rather an artisan than an artist. It did not carry with it any particular standing as a man of letters. His more serious literary pretensions were declared when he brought out his two narrative poems in the classical erotic vein, and when he privately circulated his sonnets, which would be published belatedly under other auspices. As for the plays, they were the property of the producing company, which had commissioned and bought them outright at £10 or so apiece. So long as they were popular on the stage, it would not have been in the company's interest for them to be printed. Sooner or later, slightly more than half of them found their way into print, many of these pirated and garbled through the separate editions known as quartos. Subject to such hazards of publication and to the rigors of censorship, Shakespeare's hand was obscured by anonymity while he was young and unknown, and credited apocryphally with plays by other hands when he was older and famous. On the whole, it is surprising and fortunate that the corpus of his writing has mainly come down to us through so authoritative an edition as the first folio. 7 years before that landmark appeared, Jonson had braved the scorn of critics for gathering up the plays he had written to date and bringing them out in folio as works, a format and a title which then seemed much too pretentious for mere stage pieces. Shakespeare's collected volume, edited by two of his fellow actors and theatrical partners, John Hemming and Henry Condell, bore title simply indicating the disposition of its contents: comedies, histories, and tragedies. From its appearance in 1623, 7 years after his death, Shakespeare stood among England's principal authors. But through the 17th century, he shared equal applause with the scholarly Johnson and the courtly John Fletcher. He did not emerge into the light of preeminence until Dryden signalized him as the writer who possessed the most comprehensive soul. The neoclassicists of the 18th century, emphasizing that opposition between nature and art, which Shakespeare had done so much to reconcile, thought of him as a wholly natural genius, who was consequently lacking in conscious artistry. The turning point in the history of his reputation came with the preface to Samuel Johnson's edition of 1765. It was Dr. Johnson who, rescuing Shakespeare from the indignity of being harshly judged by neoclassical rules, instead insisted on granting him the status of a classic. If his plays followed certain laws of their own, henceforth the path lay open to the discovery of those laws. But the Romantics were as eager to associate him with nature itself as their predecessors had been to distinguish his endeavors from their notions of art. Even Ben Jonson's eulogy had been, as he dryly put it, on this side of idolatry. During the later 18th and most of the 19th century, Shakespeare's interpreters practiced what Bernard Shaw liked to call bardolatry. They all but deified the Bard of Avon, because he was the creator of so many characters, could be treated as if they were human beings, could be identified with, psychologized over, arraigned for moral judgment. Shakespeare's full-bodied realism, as opposed to the more formal characterization of continental drama, meanwhile triumphed over the barriers of verse translation. His name became a rallying cry in the campaigns for Romanticism, and his influence contributed to the self-realization of the various national literatures of Europe. Our century, which has latterly celebrated the 400th anniversary of his birth, has brought him the 12th generation of his continuing audience. Yet despite the ever-widening time span, we may approach him somewhat more closely today than we could have done at intervals in the past. Historical knowledge of his period has helped to bridge the gap, while a comparative view of the drama is helping us to see his work in more extended and clarifying perspective. So much interpretation has surrounded it that we sometimes barely glimpse the forest because of the many screeds which the commentators like his Orlando have hung upon the trees. But commentary is useful in alerting us to assumptions or implications we might have missed, and editorial scholarship has learned to correct distortions by removing incrustations. It is the purpose of this introduction and of the comments that herewith introduce and accompany Shakespeare's texts to set them into their most meaningful contexts. Universal as his attraction has been, it is best understood through particulars. Though to our advantage his creations are relatively timeless, they would not mean so much to us if they had not been timely in their day. Nor would they have made their lasting impact if their author had not been past master of his exacting and exciting medium, linguistic, poetic, dramatic. Since that mastery was the ripe attainment of an individual mind, we owe some attention to the man in his time before turning to the materials and techniques of his art. Contrary to a fairly widespread impression, there is no special mystery about his life. Indeed, it is unusually well documented for commoners of his period. Unfortunately for our personal curiosity, most of this documentation takes the colorless form of entries in parish registers or municipal archives. Legal instruments involving property, all too fragmentary theatrical records, and a few business letters to or about him. The biographical outline provided by more than 100 such documents is filled in by well over 50 literary allusions to Shakespeare and his works in the published writings of contemporaries. But these details, even when they have been eked out by traditions and conjectures, scarcely combine to portray a vivid personality. Modern readers, accustomed by the Romantics to poets who lived their poems and dramatized their lives, have felt somewhat put off by the undramatic nature of the dramatist's private career. The figure of Shakespeare as a practical man of affairs, although well attested by the evidence, seemed rather too modest to occupy the lofty pedestal reared by the idolaters. Hence the strange proliferation of irresponsible theories proposing rival candidates for the authorship of Shakespeare's work, most of them titled and all of them colorful, but none of them circumstanced to have done the job, as William Shakespeare indubitably was. His existence should not seem uneventful if we consider that its main events were the 38 plays created in rapid succession and brilliant diversity within a span of less than 25 years. The first recorded fact under the family name at Stratford-on-Avon is neither inspiring nor revealing. It is the imposition of a fine upon the poet's father for countenancing a dunghill too near the house and shop on Henley Street, though he pointed out as Shakespeare's birthplace. What would be truly significant was the son's lifelong connection with the prosperous and picturesque market town in the rich heart of rural England. He was a country boy, and he kept returning to the Warwickshire countryside like the fabled giant who renewed his energies by touching his native soil. North of the winding Avon lay the forest of Arden, which must have cast some shade on the woodland scenes of As You Like It, even though the play introduces tropical flora and fauna and is linked by verbal associations with the Franco-Belgian Ardennes. The association that means most here, however, is the fact that Shakespeare's mother had been Mary Arden, and that her yeoman family was related to those Ardens who held large estates nearby. Her husband, John Shakespeare, son of a local tenant farmer, was by trade a glover or leather worker. He became one of Stratford's leading citizens, was elected a burgess or member of the town council, acted as magistrate and in various civic capacities, and served a brief term as bailiff or mayor during William's infancy. Though John's fortunes declined before his death in 1601, about the time when Hamlet was being completed, he lived to be granted the arms and style of a gentleman, probably through the endeavors and successes of his son. Thus, like many good English families, the Shakespeares made the transition from the status of tradesman to that of esquire during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. The name of their eldest son, William, appears first on record under the date of his baptism, April 26, 1564, at the Church of the Holy Trinity, where he was to be buried just 52 years afterward. Since the day of his death in 1616 was, if the inscription on his monument in the church can be trusted, April 23rd, which is also the holiday of England's patron, St. George, it is coincidentally celebrated as Shakespeare's birthday. Because the sons of burgesses were specifically entitled to free tuition at the local grammar school, it seems most probable that he studied there, absorbing a curriculum strongly based on rhetoric, Christian ethics, and classical literature. He did not go on to attend a university, and understandably, he would not be regarded as a man of learning by such consciously erudite humanists as Johnson and Milton. But our age is so much less devoted than theirs to the cultivation of the classics that what looked to Johnson like small Latin and less Greek might well strike us as a respectable grounding in the humanities. His plays show amply that he was conversant with Latin and French, plus a smattering of other foreign languages, history, both ancient, notably Plutarch, and modern, the British Chronicles, philosophic speculation, Montaigne, continental fiction such as Boccaccio's earlier English poets like Chaucer and Gower, not to mention fellow Elizabethans, from the high-minded Sidney to the abusive Green. A writer's reading tends to reveal itself most directly through his earliest efforts, and Shakespeare's smell somewhat of the Greco-Roman lamp in their use of quotation and mythological ornament. The prototypes for academic drama, as Polonius would duly observe, were Seneca for tragedy and Plautus for comedy. It is no accident that the apprentice Shakespeare, while feeling his way toward popular dramatic forms of his own, was to experiment with the Senecan Titus Andronicus and the Plautine Comedy of Errors. And it is noteworthy that Francis Meres, when he attempted a survey of English writers in his Palladis Tamia of 1598, cited Shakespeare as the versatile counterparts of both Roman playwrights, also mentioning Ovid as his forerunner in the field of amorous poetry. One of the better grounded Shakespearean rumors, coming down to us from an actor in his troupe, tells us that he taught Latin for a while as a country schoolmaster. But he has expressed his opinion of pedantry and Holofernes and Love's Labour's Lost. The book learning that Shakespeare displays here and there is far less impressive in the long run than his fund of general information. His frame of reference is so far-ranging, and he is so concretely versed in the tricks of so many trades that lawyers have written to prove he was trained in the law, sailors about his expert seamanship, naturalists upon his botanizing, and so on through the professions. If this be paradox, it is resolved by Fielding's remark that Shakespeare was learned in human nature. So far as education has genuine meaning, he must be viewed as a genuinely educated man. Some confusion seems to attend the facts regarding his marriage, but these are too meager to encourage surmises. We know that a license was obtained on November 27th, 1582, that the former Anne Hathaway was 8 years his senior, and that their elder daughter, Susanna, was born 6 months later and christened on May 26, 1583. But since the betrothal might have taken place at some previous point, we may allow the couple the benefit of ceremonies timed more casually in their day than in ours. Nor should we infer any reservations about his wife from the one bequeathed to her in his will. That second best bed may have been hallowed by conjugal sentiments, and she was provided for otherwise through her dower rights. Given the circumstances of his calling, which inevitably had centered on London and occasionally branched out into provincial tours, it could be said that he was at some pains to keep up his domestic ties with Stratford. Twin children, Hamnet and Judith, were born there in 1585. Hamnet, his only son, was to die 11 years later. Biography loses sight of Shakespeare during the interval between the birth of the twins and Green's attack in 1592, but the latter makes it quite explicit that Shakespeare had meanwhile become a player and was already emerging as a playwright. Retrospectively, it would seem clear that those crucial 7 years had been fully occupied, not to say well spent, in preparing to meet the demands of the theatrical profession and to endow it with a steady sequence of its finest vehicles. Though he is listed as having appeared in his own plays and Johnson's, we have no account of his acting. The two roles that tradition has assigned to him are secondary, though not uncongenial: the ghost in Hamlet, and the old servitor Adam in As You Like It. In any case, the fundamental certainty about Shakespeare is that he was a man of the theatre to his fingertips. No titled amateur could have conceivably handled with such practiced and inventive skill all the available resources of his professional medium. His craftsmanship as a dramatist was solidly backed, like Moliere's, by long experience as an actor-manager, by the manager's sense of the public, as well as the actor's talent for projecting himself into other selves. During the seasons of 1592 to 1593, the plague was making its terrible visitations, and while the London theatres were closed, Shakespeare seems to have been composing his non-dramatic Ovidian poems Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. When the theatres reopened, he was one of the sharers or partners in a newly organized company under the sponsorship of the Lord Chamberlain, head of the royal household. The company was to dominate the Elizabethan and Jacobean stage in the later period under the sponsorship of King James himself, performing publicly at the famous Globe Playhouse and for smaller audiences at the Blackfriars. Along with its best-known actors, Richard Burbage and William Kemp, he received payment for presenting 2 plays before the Queen at court during the Christmas festivities of 1594. The Chamberlain's men had not infrequent occasion to offer such command performances, and after 1603, when the troupe became His Majesty's servants, its sharers were officially treated as members of the royal household. Shakespeare made other connections with courtly circles, principally through the patronage of the dashing young Earl of Southampton, to whom he had dedicated both of his printed poems. Southampton is one of those actual personages who have been identified with the noble youth addressed in Shakespeare's sonnets. On the theme, there has been in Falstaffian disproportion an intolerable deal of conjecture to 1/2 pennyworth of fact. And if the sonnets constitute the key with which Shakespeare unlocked his heart, in Wordsworth's unguarded phrase, then they have opened no secret doors. If they had done so, as Browning retorted, the less Shakespeare he. To reread them as if they were confessions is to beg a moot question, since there is just as little external support for attempts at other identifications. The Dark Lady, the rival poet. Doubtless, Shakespeare could not have dealt so movingly with love and friendship and with literary and sexual rivalry if he had not experienced them in some intimate guise, but his sonnets would differ unbelievably from his plays, and would come suspiciously close to the effusions of more subjective writers if he had not again been exercising his gift for dramatic projection. The sonneteer's involvement with his formal genre is that of the dramatist with his dramatis personae. After all, it is he himself who assumes the identities of his characters. My nature is subdued to what it works in like the dyer's hand. Sonnet 111.67. The advance in Shakespeare's worldly fortunes is evident from a number of business transactions. In 1597, he acquired New Place, one of the most substantial residences in Stratford. Gradually, he had given up acting for writing, and by his late 40s, several years before his relatively early death, he was living in retirement there. His meticulous testament, which remembers his colleagues, seems designed to perpetuate his estate through his elder daughter's progeny, but his line did not survive his grandchildren. For his many living descendants, we must look to the drama. His monument, the bust in the chancel of Holy Trinity Church, is thought to be a true, if stylized, portrait. The same benignant features greet the reader from the frontispiece to the folio. The recurrent word in the testimonials of Shakespeare's friends and acquaintances is gentle. It characterizes an engaging but self-effacing person who, while remaining impersonal, could penetrate the minds of multitudinous personalities. Coleridge described him as myriad-minded. Keats suggested how those many aspects must have been integrated when he spoke of negative capability, that quality of sympathetic imagination, that unexampled gift of insight which enabled Shakespeare to empathize with all sorts and conditions of men. It was Keats again who threw light on the symbolic relation between an artist's modus vivendi and his artistic achievement, when he succinctly noted, Shakespeare lived a life of allegory. His works are the comments on it. All lives are more or less allegorical insofar as they relive the cycle of every man. Shakespeare's uniqueness lies in his commentary, his memorable power of individualizing those common experiences. The course of his worldly career has sometimes been subdivided into 4 periods, which were neatly but problematically formulated by Edward Dowden. To label the first period in the workshop and the second in the world is cogent enough, though it merely implies an objective development from apprenticeship to maturity to the mastery of a craft. But to call the third phase out of the depths and the fourth on the heights is to misread the plays by presuming that Shakespeare intended them as successive chapters in a kind of spiritual autobiography. We are less well acquainted with what went into his work than with what came out of it. That there are emotions of despair in Hamlet and attitudes of serenity in The Tempest, we cannot doubt. He could not simply have chosen to write tragedies while he was feeling depressed and comedies when a mellower mood came upon him. There were more determining factors, as we shall see. Clearly, the man who wrote Romeo and Juliet knew what it felt like to be in love. It may be that the author of King Lear had known sufferings that brought him near to madness, but by following that line of rationalization, we reduce it to the absurd presumption that the author of Macbeth had committed murder, whereas the play is an imaginative exercise, a psychological discipline which we undergo with the playwright, who, by conveying what it might feel like to be a murderer, ends by enlarging our consciousness. Historical background. We can follow the development of Shakespeare's work in greater clarity if we view it as a response to and an expression of the proud and eventful period in which he lived, and for which he constructed the principal monument. To recollect that the year of his birth marked the deaths of both Michelangelo and Calvin is to set him at the zenith of the 2 great formative movements in the arts and religion that they personify, the Renaissance and the Reformation. The year of his own death also bore witness to Harvey's first lectures on physiology, heralding a momentous succession of new achievements for scientific method. Putting Shakespeare beside his immediate contemporaries, we may note that he was born in the same year as Galileo and died in the same year as Cervantes. Cervantes is said to have written an epitaph for the Middle Ages by demonstrating through the very first of modern novels that the invention of gunpowder had exploded the institution of chivalry. Yet Shakespeare seems to have anticipated that point in 1 Henry IV, where the antagonistic conceptions of honor advanced by Hotspur and Falstaff run parallel to the ideological argument between Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. And Shakespeare seems to have anticipated Galileo's demonstration that the earth revolves around the sun, which supported the astronomical challenge to the anthropocentric conception of the universe, when Hamlet wrote in his little metaphysical poem addressed to Ophelia, "Doubt thou that the stars are five, doubt that the sun doth moon." But heretical doubts were still counterweighted by the orthodox belief that the human race played the central role in a cosmic spectacle, whose interpretation might be sought in the antiquated pseudoscience of astrology, as Sonnet 15 affirms in a characteristically theatrical metaphor, that this huge stage presenteth naught but shows, whereon the stars in secret influence comment. The drama is the most social of literary forms, since it stands in so direct a relationship to its audience. Hence, it presupposes certain fostering conditions, and its golden ages have been sporadic in finding their conjunctions of time and place. Ancient Athens, classical France, Baroque Spain, Zen Buddhist Japan, and Shakespeare's lifetime in England. We like to look back on his age as the spacious times of great Elizabeth. The nostalgic phrase of Queen Victoria's poet laureate Tennyson conjures up the national cult of the Virgin Queen, with its emanations of courtly compliment and magnificent pageantry. Elizabethan men of letters vied with courtiers in paying their elaborate respects to the royal coquette, most elaborately in Spenser's Faerie Queene. Shakespeare was not remiss in declaring his homage, gallantly alluding to a fair vestal throned by the west in a midsummer night's dream, and retroactively prophesying blessings for the reign of the newly christened Princess Elizabeth and Henry VIII. But the spaciousness of the times found surer justification in its discoveries, conquests, and hitherto unparalleled geographical expansion. This England, of which the bastard Falconbridge boasts in King John, and for which John of Gaunt voices his fears in Richard II, was breathlessly transforming itself from an island off the coast of Europe into a dominant sea power and an emergent colonial empire. Shakespeare was well abreast of what was happening. The Tempest reenacts a shipwreck encountered by the Virginia Company's fleet. Conversely, Hamlet and Richard II were performed on the East India Company's flagship off the coast of Sierra Leone in 1607. The imperial trend, which had its prose epic in the voyages chronicled by Hakluyt and Purchas, brought commercial affluence in its wake, but rapidly accumulating wealth, inequitably distributed at best, was by no means a guarantee of widespread economic security. The discontented populace of Shakespeare's Roman plays and the hungry followers of Jack Cade and Henry VI lend a prefiguring voice to protests against the enclosure of common lands and other social grievances of the 16th century. England's main international effort during the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance had been to disentangle the ties that had bound her to France since the Norman conquest. The rhythm of Shakespeare's history plays, which is agitated by the battles of the Hundred Years' War, accelerates to its patriotic climax with the triumph of Henry V at Agincourt. The long drawn-out civil conflict, the struggle among the barons over the kingship, had led on through the Wars of the Roses to the attrition of feudal power and the establishment of a more centralized monarchy under the House of Tudor, a consummation which Shakespeare hails at the end of Richard III. For him, as for the chroniclers he rather freely followed, the compendious Holinshed, and especially the apologist Edward Hall, the Tudors had conjointly inherited the strongest claims of their warring predecessors, the houses of York and Lancaster. Their enthronement seemed to have been providentially ordained to foster the restoration of peace, with the attendant cultural benefits that distinguish a glorious epoch. Loyal subjects were bound to see the whole historical sequence as the consummation of a legendary design. Shakespeare even envisages a laying on of hands between the last of the Lancastrian kings, the ill-fated Henry VI, and the founder of the Tudor line, the young Earl of Richmond, later to be crowned as Henry VII. Yet the claim of the Lancasters was itself open to question, since their crown had been wrenched away from Richard II by Henry IV, practicing an admixture of force and policy, a word which always connotes the intrigues of Machiavellian statecraft. The situation, as Shakespeare has treated it, illustrates the division of loyalties that intensify the complications of king-making and unmaking. Ideally, God's ruler can do no wrong. He rules by divine right, as the legitimate Richard ineffectually reminds his refractory peers. The blame for his mistakes is largely placed upon his parasitical favorites, those caterpillars of the Commonwealth. At all events, there is nothing that could morally justify his dethronement, and the scene of Richard's deposition was considered such political tinder that it was omitted from the early quartos of that play. Consequently, Henry's rule is regarded by his enemies as a usurpation, though he is much abler than his deposed cousin, and the curse of the Plantagenets hangs heavy over the destinies of the Lancastrians. In their turn, the latter yield to the brief and violent Yorkist dynasty, culminating in the nightmarish regime of the arch-usurper Richard III, from which the Tudors bring about England's happy deliverance. Their strategy was that of the popular monarch, firmly controlling baronial factions while commanding enthusiastic loyalty from the common people. Shakespeare's commoners are as likely to be misled by demagogues as his kings are by self-serving counselors. But when king and people strive together in mutual confidence, then they fulfill the basic Tudor principle of common weal. Unhappily, the ensuing era of stability and prosperity was menaced and riven by religious dissension. The English Reformation, made official at the personal behest of the sovereign, Henry VIII, broke politically with the Roman Catholic Church, but did not embrace the theological doctrines of the extreme Puritans. During the short reigns of Henry's son and elder daughter, Edward VI and Bloody Mary, Catholics and Protestants were successively persecuted, the Queen having married the King of Spain and attempted to revive Catholicism in England. The accession of Henry's younger daughter, Elizabeth, in 1558 reaffirmed and established the Anglican Compromise, while the Tudor dynasty was guided to its culmination through her fortunate gifts, which included longevity. Thus, the intellectual climate surrounding Shakespeare was one in which inherited dogmas have been forcibly questioned and strategically modified. Like all Elizabethans, he was, at least nominally, an Anglican whose forebears had been brought up in the Catholic confession. Unlike the majority of contemporary believers, he was tolerant enough to enter into the spirit of both faiths with that wonderful philosophic impartiality which Coleridge has discerned in his politics. The tone of his comedies is somewhat affected by the bustle of current mercantile enterprise. Even their foreign settings seem to reflect an increasingly cosmopolitan outlook. Through the resounding series of explorations, exploitations, and naval campaigns against Spain, with the Western Hemisphere as the grand prize, England was achieving its leadership among nations. The climactic decade of Elizabeth's reign occurred between the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, loves, labors, lost, jibes at its fallen vainglory in the mock heroic person of Don Armado, and the return of the Essex expedition from Ireland in 1599, welcomed in triumphal expectation by the chorus in the fifth act of Henry V. Shakespeare, who was even then moving through the dramatic workshop into a wider world, expressed the upsurging nationalism of those fervent years through his cycle of history plays. All but the belated Henry VIII were produced during that decade. But the Irish expedition proved a failure. The brilliant Earl of Essex, long the Queen's favorite, was precipitated from her favor, and after an abortive conspiracy against her, he was beheaded in 1601. Confronted with an aging queen, the unsettled problem of her succession, and the mounting unrest at the turn of the century, many anxious and thoughtful Englishmen had pinned their hopes upon him. Possibly Shakespeare had done so. We know that his company's revival of Richard II as a possible incitement to treason topically figured in Essex's trial. His downfall heralded the approaching transition, as did the concurrent appearance of Hamlet. A modulation, deeper perhaps and sadder and wiser than the conventionally mellow Elizabethan note, could be heard in the literature of the later 1590s as writers turned away from sonnets to satires, cultivated their melancholia, and began to sound the depths of tragedy. It may be symptomatic, if not prophetic, that the typical protagonist of Jacobean drama is rather a disinherited prince than a self-crowned king. James I, who finally succeeded Elizabeth upon her demise in 1603, never approached her in popularity. Yet since he was already King James VI of Scotland, his accession united the crowns of both kingdoms, and being a conscientious patron of letters, he accorded royal sponsorship to the Shakespearean troupe, as well as to the standard English Bible that perpetuates his name. Shakespeare, for his part, paid homage to the new king with Macbeth, not only by choosing a Scottish theme, but more specifically by recalling the legend that traced the Stuart line back to Banquo. Shakespeare's witches predict a brighter future for the Stuarts than they were to have, and James himself stored up trouble for his successors by promoting a courtly aristocracy and alienating a more and more puritanical middle class. But the most salient characteristic of Jacobean culture was its devotion to the pursuit of knowledge, which involved the most searching introspection and the most fanciful speculation, along with the ambitious program for science that Bacon outlined in his Advancement of Learning. And new philosophy, as Donne lamented, calls all in doubt. Shakespeare, of course, was a playwright and not a philosopher, yet drama is dialectic in concrete form. The attitudes and actions of its characters would have little value or meaning if they were not based on certain philosophical premises. Shakespeare's plays are very richly charged with implicit ideas, some of which are made memorably explicit by sententious remarks or purple passages whose purpose is to keep us well aware of the larger issues and moral implications. One of his fullest statements in this vein, the monologue of Ulysses on degree in Troilus and Cressida, frames his weary Greek heroes against a backdrop as wide as the universe. But this particular universe is the traditional cosmos of Ptolemaic astronomy, where the planets revolve around the Earth in concentric orbits, influencing human destiny in ways that the astrologers claimed to interpret. This macrocosm centers upon that microcosm, which is man, in whose person the elements are mixed, the humors disposed, and the faculties governed to accord with a similar pattern. Hence King Lear, within his little world of man, reproduces the storm that rages upon the heath. His psychological breakdown has its external counterpart in the disintegration of his kingdom. The body politic resembles the human body. The order of physical nature is a visible mirror of the divine order. The age-old conception of a great chain of being, extending from God through the angels toward mankind and downward to beasts, plants, and inanimate matter, links together all created things. Prospero, through his natural magic, is served by the ethereal Ariel from on high and by the bestial Caliban at the subhuman level. Given this all-embracing continuity, every creature must adhere to its hierarchic position in order to discharge its preordained function, must, in Ulysses' words, observe degree, priority, and place. The stars set the universal example, and it is their harmonious functioning that generates the music of the spheres. All is well with societies, families, and individuals when they do their duties and know their places. But when they stray out of orbit, Ulysses warns of disastrous consequences, shifting his comparison from the planetary to the musical plane. Take but degree away, untune that string, and hark what discord follows. Each thing meets in mere oppugnancy. The bounded waters should lift their bosoms higher than the shores and make a sop of all this solid globe. It seems unlikely that so word-conscious a writer could have penned that last line without a side glance at the theater where his plays were being performed, for the globe was truly a microcosm or little world of man, an artistic replica of the whole human condition. As for its solidity, we are told in The Tempest that Prospero's pageant and the great globe itself have been compounded of the same insubstantial fabric, the stuff of dreams. Ulysses, having sketched his ideal world order, visualizes its impending dissolution and opens up a harrowing prospect of chaos and anarchy. Similarly, a number of Shakespeare's histories and his tragedies take place in a time misordered, which the hero is called upon to set right, while his comedies revel in timeless disorder until the norms of society are restored by the happy ending. Now, as between a set of professed ideals and the observed realities of experience, there is usually some sort of gap or lag which tends to widen during critical periods such as the Renaissance, thereby amplifying the dimensions of the tragic or the comic point of view. And if the accepted worldview was founded upon obsolete cosmology, as the scientists were impressively showing, then scholastic traditions could be undermined by experimental approaches, and monarchic authority itself would soon be challenged by more democratic ideologies. The humanism of the Renaissance, with its consciousness of historic renewal, its revivals of the classics and the fine arts, its confidence in the mind, and its embellishment of its material surroundings, was a flowering of plenitude, to be sure, but it was likewise a crisis of uncertainty. It balanced the immediacies of this world against otherworldly values. Its enjoyment of the senses quickened the lively spirits of comedy, but its fullness of life was deeply grounded in the inevitability of death, which is the precondition of tragedy. The medieval vision, with its tangible hopes for an afterlife in the next world, found its fulfillment in a divine comedy. In the Middle Ages, tragedies were falls of princes, like Richard II's sad stories of the deaths of kings. Men's decline from prosperity to adversity taught a moral lesson by manifesting the power of providence and the transience of mere earthly glory. The fickle birch goddess, Fortune, determined the fates of captains and kings, alike with beggars and clowns, through the revolutions of her allegorical wheel. To suffer her slings and arrows had been the sanctioned course. To take arms against them was a novel and tempting alternative. To become the captain of one's fate, to make one's own fortune, to rise in the world by exerting one's will. It is through this dynamic choice that the self-reliant protagonists of Marlowe's plays attain their heroic stature. The individualism of Dr. Faustus, exploring all the available possibilities, recognizes no limits. Shakespeare reveals a more comprehensive awareness of the opposing forces that take the measure of the individual and of the resulting interplay between character and destiny. The exclamation of Hamlet, "What a piece of work is man! What a piece of work is a man!" carries an ironic reverberation. His melancholy gaze looks up and down, skyward toward this brave o'erhanging firmament, and earthward toward the grave. Those two portraits which he shows to the Queen illustrate man's potentialities for good and for evil. The scale ascends or descends with the spiritual and carnal aspects of his dual nature. He can aspire to be a godlike Hyperion, or else can grovel like a brutal satyr. Hamlet's existential dilemma echoes the self-interrogations of Montaigne, not merely through the language of John Floyer's translation, but in its ambiguous balance between skepticism and faith. Though the supernatural is invoked and evoked throughout Shakespeare's work, it remains, as it doubtless should, an ultimate mystery. We are mystified with Hamlet over questions which were highly problematic in Shakespeare's day. We share the suspense over whether the ghost is real or false, and whether it has been sent from heaven, purgatory, or hell. With Lady Macbeth, we suspect that the apparition of Banquo may be a subjective phenomenon, while the dagger of the mind might conceivably be the playwright's expressionistic device for conveying Macbeth's remorse of conscience. As for the witches, though they foretell the outcome, they do not control it, since the prophecies are equivocations, and Macbeth is free to choose at every stage. Omens and dreams portending catastrophes, though they are often greeted with disbelief, charge the air with fatality when they come true. Most of the plays, unfolding within a biblical frame of reference, broadly conform to the tenets of Christianity. Witness the enforced conversion of Shylock the Jew. Yet King Lear deliberately reverts to a pre-Christian Britain, where the gods are pluralized and supplicated by pagan names, and where the enigma of their relation to men is argued back and forth. Is it supernal grace or naturalistic indifference, poetic justice or cosmic irony? Moreover, the characters in the Roman plays are measured by the ethics of Stoicism. Suicide is denounced in the tragedies subject to Christian doctrine. Hamlet resists it because God's ethical canon is set against self-slaughter. And Ophelia's funeral rites are abridged because her death was doubtful. Whereas in the environment of Rome and under the danger of humiliation, self-inflicted death can be an act of greatness, ennobling the final moments of both Cleopatra and Brutus. An anachronistic clock is mentioned in Julius Caesar and has been charged that Shakespeare's Romans are Elizabethans thinly disguised. Yet in our single drawing of a contemporaneous Shakespearean production, the cast of Titus Andronicus is depicted in something like Roman dress. What is more important, Shakespeare has used his imagination to catch the moral atmosphere breathed by his ancient heroes. His recreation of a vital past is animated by the sense of living in a time of greatness, which is so energetically affirmed by King Henry V in his speech on St. Crispin's Day. As the Earl of Warwick calls Henry IV, there is a history in all men's lives. To be continued.